Section 3 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1. Chapter 1. The Watergate Break-In and its Prelude, Part 3. C. The Planning of Gemstone. From the time that G. Gordon Liddy was appointed CRP General Counsel in December 1971, his principal efforts were devoted to developing, advocating, and implementing a comprehensive political intelligence gathering program for CRP under the code name Gemstone. The Select Committee's knowledge of Liddy's activities comes from sources other than Liddy himself, since he refused to testify, although instructed to do so by the committee upon the conference pursuant to court order of use immunity. Liddy's role in the Gemstone plan was detailed to the committee through the testimonies of James McCord, Jeb Stuart Magruder, John Dean, John Mitchell, and E. Howard Hunt. Although it is not clear from the testimony who originated the Gemstone concept, there is no dispute that it was Liddy who, with the aid of Hunt and McCord, formulated the plan and presented it for approval to Dean, Magruder, and Mitchell. 1. The meeting of January 27, 1972. The first Gemstone plan was presented to Attorney General Mitchell by Liddy at a meeting in Mitchell's Justice Department office on January 27, 1972. Magruder and Dean were also in attendance. The plan was a Liddy, Hunt, and McCord composite. McCord's input was the budget for the equipment needed to implement the electronic surveillance aspects of the plan. Hunt, still employed at the White House, aided Liddy in formulating the plans for other intelligence gathering operations. The testimony of Mitchell, Dean, and Magruder as to this meeting is fairly consistent concerning the nature of Liddy's presentation and the general contents of the plan. Liddy illustrated his presentation with 6 large white posters on an easel, each one portraying a specific coded component of the overall plan. The plan called for 1. The use of mugging squads and kidnapping teams to deal with leaders of anti-Nixon demonstrations. 2. Prostitutes stationed on a yacht wired for sound, anchored offshore from Miami Beach during the Democratic Convention. 3. Electronic surveillance and break-ins at various targets not yet identified at the time of the meeting. The budget for the plan was $1 million. Liddy's plan was not approved at the meeting. Dean testified that he was surprised at Liddy's plan and had not known of its contents prior to the meeting. He testified that Mitchell was likewise amazed and told Liddy to revise the plan, focusing on the problem of demonstrations. Magruder testified that he and Dean also indicated to Liddy that the project must be redone. According to Dean, Mitchell told him privately that Liddy's proposal was out of the question. Mitchell testified that at the January 27th meeting, he told Liddy to take the stuff out and burn it. However, Hunt testified that Liddy reported that the plan had been turned down because it was too expensive, and that he, that is Liddy, had been instructed to redraft it. McCord confirms this testimony. Despite these reactions of record by those who listened to Liddy's plan on January 27th, the fact remains that such a plan was presented in the office of the Attorney General of the United States and that Liddy, after the meeting, still held his position as CRP General Counsel and continued to have the responsibility of developing an intelligence gathering plan. Magruder testified that he reported the details of this meeting to Strockman in accordance with his custom of keeping Strockman advised on important matters so he, that is Strockman, could report to Haldeman. Strockman, however, claimed that Magruder mentioned nothing to him regarding a CRP intelligence plan until after March 30, 1972. 2. The February 4, 1972 meeting. On February 4, 1972, the same group again met in the Attorney General's office and listened to Liddy present a watered-down version of his intelligence plan. This time, the plan called only for surreptitious photography and electronic surveillance. The budget for the new plan had been stripped down to $500,000. According to Magruder, Mitchell actually discussed possible targets for the new plan, including the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington and at the convention, and the headquarters of the Democratic nominee. Also, according to Magruder, Mitchell suggested as additional targets DNC chairman Larry O'Brien and Las Vegas publisher Hank Greenspun, who allegedly had explosive material damaging to Senator Muskie in his office safe. Liddy's proposal, Magruder testified, was not approved at the February 4th meeting, but postponed for consideration at a later time. Dean testified that, after arriving late for this meeting, he advised Liddy that such discussions should not go on in front of the Attorney General of the United States. After the meeting, Dean testified, he told Liddy that he would never again discuss the matter with him and that, if Liddy's plan were approved, he did not want to know. Mitchell testified that he and Dean were still aghast at Liddy's proposal. Liddy apparently left the meeting believing that the basics of his plan were unobjectionable, but that his budget was still too high. Moreover, McCord testified that Liddy said Dean had stated to Liddy that a method would have to be devised to ensure Mitchell's deniability regarding the operation, including the means by which the money would be dispersed. Magruder also testified that a discussion concerning the Attorney General's deniability took place at the February 4th meeting. Dean testified that Liddy may have misunderstood his statements concerning the impropriety of discussing the plan in front of the Attorney General and believed that Dean's only concern was with Mitchell's deniability, not with the appropriateness of the plan. Magruder testified that once again after the meeting, he reported the events to Strockman so Haldeman could be informed. This time, Magruder testified, he sent Strockman the documents Liddy had presented at the meeting, including budget sheets, and told Strockman by telephone the general content of the meeting, including the specific proposed targets for the intelligence operation. Strockman, according to Magruder, told him that any decision made by Mitchell regarding the bugging proposal was acceptable to the White House. But Strockman, during his testimony, denied receiving this information from Magruder after the February 4th meeting and claimed he had no knowledge of the Liddy plan until after March 30, 1972. Dean testified that, following this meeting, he met with Haldeman and told him about the meeting and the Liddy plan. He testified that he expressed his own view that the plan was incredible, unnecessary, and unwise, and that the White House should have nothing to do with it. Haldeman, according to Dean, agreed and instructed him to have no further dealings on the matter. Thus, according to both Magruder's and Dean's testimony, Haldeman knew about the Liddy intelligence plan after the February 4th meeting. Haldeman testified that he has no recollection of Dean's telling him about the February 4th meeting, but was willing to accept Dean's version of this conversation. But on March 27, 1973, Haldeman admitted to the president that he had a meeting with Dean during which Dean warned him about Liddy's plan and recommended that it be dropped. Moreover, Dean informed the president of his conversation with Haldeman, telling the president, "Bob and I have gone over that after the fact, and he recalls my coming to the office and telling him about this crazy scheme that has been cooked up." While Dean may have felt the plan had been disapproved, Magruder did not leave the February 4th meeting with that view, since, as subsequent developments show, he continued to work with Liddy on modifying the plan, and on March 30, 1972, presented it himself a third time to Mitchell in Key Biscayne, Florida. It is also noteworthy that, after the February 4th meeting, Liddy continued to serve as general counsel for CRP. 3. The Colson phone call. There is evidence that Liddy believed he needed additional White House assistance to get his intelligence plan approved. after the February 4th meeting, and before his meeting with Mitchell in Key Biscayne on March 30th, Magruder, according to his testimony, received a call from Charles Colson, special counsel to the president, who told him to "get on the stick and get the Liddy project approved so we can get the information from O'Brien." Hunt testified that, after the February 4th meeting, Liddy requested an introduction to Colson and that he brought Liddy to Colson's office. Hunt said he sat in the rear of the office while Liddy and Colson conversed and was not involved in their discussion. Colson made some phone calls during the conversation. Colson did not testify under oath before the committee, but asserted his Fifth Amendment privilege after he was informed he was a target of the grand jury. However, Colson had earlier submitted to a staff interview. At that time, Colson admitted that Liddy and Hunt told him they could not get anyone to listen to them and that he, therefore, called Magruder to ask him to hear their plan. Colson summarized this meeting with Liddy and Hunt in a June 20, 1972 memorandum. Colson said Hunt and Liddy told him about elaborate proposals for security activities which they could not get approved. Colson said he called Magruder and urged resolution of the Hunt-Liddy proposal. He stated in the memorandum that he declined Hunt's offer to apprise him of the details because it was "not necessary and it was of no concern to me." Hunt, however, testified that he did not offer to provide details to Colson. In his public testimony, Hunt testified that when he left Colson's office after Colson had made the phone calls, Liddy told Hunt, "I think I may have done us some good." Hunt also testified it was not necessary in the March meeting to give Colson details about the Liddy plan. He stated that in January 1972, he had informed Colson he would be working on a special project with Liddy that would require him to use the same Cuban Americans he had employed in the Ellsberg break-in, and that Colson indicated he was aware of the comprehensive covert intelligence plan which Liddy had in preparation and which had the approval of the White House. Hunt testified, however, that Colson was not specifically aware that the DNC headquarters would be a target of the Gemstone plan. Another witness to the Colson call to Magruder was apparently Fred LaRue. Magruder testified that LaRue was in the room with him when he received the call, and Mitchell testified that LaRue told him that he was present when Colson called. LaRue, however, could not recall being present. Magruder's description of Colson's call, especially the reference to a need to "get the information from O'Brien," provides some evidence that Colson was doing more than simply being helpful to Liddy and Hunt. Dean told the president in the Oval Office on March 21, 1973, that he thought Colson's call to Magruder "helped get the thing off the dime." At the same time, Dean told the president that Strachan, on Haldeman's behalf, was pushing Magruder for intelligence information and that Magruder took that as a signal to probably go to Mitchell and to say, "They are pushing us like crazy for this from the White House." 4. The March 30, 1972 meeting. The third and final time Liddy's intelligence plan was presented to Mitchell was on March 30 in Key Biscayne, Florida. Magruder testified that he had a large number of accumulated matters, including the Liddy plan, to submit to Mitchell for his approval. By this time, the plan's budget had been reduced to $250,000. Prior to traveling to Florida, Magruder testified, he sent a copy of a memorandum on the pared-down Liddy plan to Strachan for communication to Haldeman. Magruder said this was in accordance with his practice to send key papers for discussion with Mitchell to Haldeman so that Haldeman could comment prior to his, that is Magruder's, meetings with Mitchell. Strachan, however, denied receiving an advance copy of this memorandum. Magruder testified that the Liddy memorandum was the last item discussed in his meeting with Mitchell in Key Biscayne, and that, although no one was enthusiastic after discussing its pros and cons, Mitchell approved the project. Magruder testified that the approved $250,000 project called for an initial entry into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington and at further dates, if funds were available, entries into the headquarters of the Democratic presidential contenders in Washington and at the convention in Miami. Mitchell, however, denied approving Liddy's plan. He said he told Magruder, "We don't need this. I'm tired of hearing it. Let's not discuss it any further." LaRue, who was present with Mitchell and Magruder during the discussion of the various proposals Magruder presented to Mitchell, testified that, when Mitchell asked him, that is LaRue, what he thought of Liddy's plan, he replied that it was not worth the risk, and Mitchell said, "Well, this is not something we will have to decide on at this meeting." In a March 27, 1973 meeting between the President, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, Haldeman reported on information CRP lawyer Paul O'Brien had received from Magruder. The final step in approving the Watergate break-in plan was when Gordon Strachan called Magruder and said Haldeman told him to get this going. "The President wants it done, and there is to be no more arguing about it." This, meaning the intelligence activity, the Liddy plan. Magruder told Mitchell this, that Strachan had told him to get it going on Haldeman's orders, on the President's orders, and Mitchell signed off on it. He said, "Okay, if they say to do it, go ahead." Magruder did not give information of this nature to the Select Committee in either public or executive session. In addition, during an April 14, 1973 meeting between the President, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, Ehrlichman stated that Magruder told him that Mitchell orally approved Liddy's third proposal, but that the approval was reluctant and that they, Mitchell and Magruder, felt bulldozed into doing it by Colson. 5. Financing the operation. When Magruder returned to Washington the following day, April 1st, he took certain actions that indicated his belief that the plan was approved. He told Robert Resner, his administrative assistant, that Liddy's plan had been approved and asked him to notify Liddy. He called Strachan to tell him the plan was approved and informed Hugh Sloan, FCRP treasurer, that Liddy was authorized to draw $250,000 during the campaign and would probably initially need a sizable amount. Liddy quickly requested $83,000 from Sloan. Sloan testified that he first checked Liddy's request with Magruder, who told him that it was in order and to comply. Sloan became concerned because the $250,000 budget was to come from cash funds kept in a safe in his office that represented cash received prior to April 7, 1972, the effective date of the new campaign fund reporting law. Since $83,000 was totally out of line of anything we had ever done before. Sloan took the matter up to Stans, the director of FCRP. Stans told Sloan he would check with Mitchell. After meeting with Mitchell, Stans confirmed that Magruder had authority to make this kind of decision and that Sloan should pay the funds to Liddy. Responding to Sloan's concern about the purpose of such a statement, Stans, according to Sloan, said, "I do not want to know, and you don't want to know." Although Stans disputed the context in which Sloan placed the remark, he agreed that it was the substance of what was said. Mitchell, however, testified that he only told Stans that Magruder had authority to pay money to Liddy and that there was no mention of substantial funds. Stans' meeting with Mitchell to clear the cash payment occurred only a few days after the March 30th meeting in Key Biscayne among Mitchell, Magruder, and LaRue. 6. Transmittal of information to Strachan. Magruder testified that he completely apprised Strachan of the Liddy $250,000 plan, including the fact that its first target was the Watergate D&C headquarters. In his March 13, 1973 meeting with the President, Dean told the President that Strachan had prior knowledge of the Watergate burglary. The President immediately concluded, "Well then, he probably told Bob. He may not have." Dean assured the President that Strachan would not testify against Haldeman. He was judicious in what he relayed, but Strachan is as tough as nails. He could go in and stonewall and say, "I don't know anything about what you are talking about." He has already done it twice, you know, in interviews. Strachan testified that Magruder told him only that a sophisticated political intelligence gathering system had been approved with a budget of $300,000. Strachan stated that he prepared Political Action Memorandum No. 18 for Haldeman that relayed this information. Strachan said that, when the memorandum was returned for filing, Haldeman had checked the item concerning this matter, indicating that he had read it. Haldeman, however, claimed he did not recall seeing such an item. 4 days after the March 30th meeting in Key Biscayne, Haldeman and Mitchell met. Strachan testified he prepared a talking paper for Haldeman for the meeting that included a section respecting CRP's $300,000 intelligence plan. Haldeman testified he did not recall directing Strachan to prepare this talking paper, nor did he recall seeing such a document. Haldeman and Mitchell both testified that a CRP intelligence plan was not discussed at the April 4th meeting. Haldeman testified that his meeting with Mitchell on April 4, 1972, was in connection with a meeting with the President and Mitchell, which covered the ITT Kleindienst hearings and a review of Mitchell's plans for assigning campaign responsibilities. They, that is his notes, indicate no discussion of intelligence. Also in April, according to Strachan, Haldeman called him into his office and told him to inform Liddy to transfer whatever intelligence capability Liddy had from Muskie to McGovern. Haldeman, Strachan said, had a particular interest in discovering what the connection between McGovern and Senator Kennedy was. Strachan said he made a note of the instruction, called Liddy to his office, and literally read the statement to him. D. Events leading to the break-in. 1. The McGovern headquarters attempts. In addition to the DNC offices at Watergate and propitious targets at the Miami Convention, the Watergate conspirators hoped to bug Senator George McGovern's Washington campaign headquarters. This target appears consistent with the instruction Liddy received from Haldeman through Strachan in April to transfer whatever capability he had from Muskie to McGovern, although bugging was not specifically mentioned in that instruction. McCord said he was involved in several attempts to bug McGovern's headquarters. On May 15th, McCord and Tom Gregory, a student Hunt had hired to infiltrate the McGovern campaign, walked through the McGovern headquarters in order to acquaint McCord with the office layout. Later, on the evening of May 26th, McCord and Baldwin drove to the McGovern headquarters and, through the use of walkie-talkies, rendezvoused with another car occupied by Hunt, Liddy, and others. The group had planned to break into the McGovern headquarters that evening, but, because of Gregory's absence and the continued presence of a man standing in front of the headquarters, the mission was canceled. The Watergate conspirators also unsuccessfully attempted to bug the McGovern headquarters on May 28th. McCord had hoped that the offices of Frank Mankiewicz and Gary Hart would be vacant so that bugging devices could be installed, but the mission this time was aborted because persons were working late inside the headquarters, and Gregory, who had been instructed by Hunt to position himself outside and report when they left, was asked by a policeman to leave the area. 2. The first Watergate break-in. Liddy and Hunt then turned to the main target of the Gemstone Plan, the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office building. They planned the break-in for the Memorial Day weekend. Hunt alerted his Cuban-American contact in Miami, Bernard Barker, to be prepared to bring a trained burglary team to Washington. Barker, who had performed this same type of mission for Hunt in the Ellsberg matter, had also served under Hunt in the Bay of Pigs operation. He was a refugee from his native Cuba and considered himself a patriot committed to the mission of freeing Cuba from Castro. The Cuban Americans he recruited for Hunt's projects were cut from the same cloth. The motivations of Barker and his crew were clearly stated by Baker. E. Howard Hunt, under the name of Eduardo, represents to the Cuban people their liberation. I cannot deny my services in the way that it was proposed to me on a matter of national security, knowing that with my training I had personnel available for this type of operation. I could not deny this request at that time. On May 10th or 12th, McCord and Hunt reconnoitered the Watergate office building by walking through it in the early evening after work and again around 9 or 10 p.m. On May 17, Martinez purchased 6 one-way tickets to Washington from Miami for Frank Carter, alias for Barker, J. Granada, alias for Reynaldo Pico, Joseph D. Alberto, alias for Sturgis, Raul Gaudi, alias for Gonzalez, Jose Piedra, alias for De Diego, and G. Valdez, alias for Martinez. On May 22, the Miamians registered at the Manger Hamilton Hotel in Washington, and on May 26 moved to the Watergate Hotel, where they stayed until May 30. Barker testified that he met with Hunt at the Manger Hamilton Hotel shortly after his arrival in Washington, and Hunt explained to him the general nature of the mission. Barker, however, did not relay the nature of the assignment to his team until just before entry into the DNC headquarters. At that time, the different tasks of the participants were discussed. By the early morning hours of May 28, the Watergate conspirators, after 2 frustrated attempts, completed their first break-in of the DNC. The entry was made late on May 27, when Gonzalez picked the lock of the ground floor door of the Watergate office building. The burglary team then went to the 6th floor offices of the DNC headquarters. McCord placed electronic bugging devices, miniature transmitters, in the telephones of the DNC chairman, Larry O'Brien, and another official, Spencer Oliver, and Barker and his team photographed papers from DNC files. 3. The fruits of the first break-in. After the DNC telephones were tapped, Alfred Baldwin, a former FBI agent recruited by McCord, monitored intercepted telephone conversations from a room in the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge across the street from the Watergate office building. He typed the conversations almost verbatim and gave the logs to McCord. McCord gave the logs to Liddy, who had several retyped by his secretary, Sally Harmon. Liddy told McCord he wanted them in final form before his discussions with Mitchell and other recipients of the logs. The Gemstone project had its own stationery with the word Gemstone printed in large letters at the top. Sally Harmon testified she used Gemstone stationery when she retyped the telephone logs. Harmon also said she saw a stack of 8 by 10-inch photographs of documents from the DNC headquarters held by fingers in rubber gloves. Ms. Harmon testified that she began to type certain general intelligence memorandums for Liddy in April that led her to believe that CRP had infiltrated the headquarters of McGovern and Muskie. In keeping with the spy motif that characterized Liddy's operations, code names referring to information sources were used in the intelligence memorandums. The 3 code names she could recall were Ruby 1, Ruby 2, and Crystal. Magruder testified that, after Liddy's project was approved, he did not hear from Liddy until after May 27, when Liddy reported the DNC break-in and installation of the telephone tapping devices. Magruder said he reported the May 27 entry to Strockman, but at that time gave Strockman no further details. After the May 27 DNC break-in, Magruder received from Liddy 2 installments of documents embodying the fruits of the break-in. The installments included summaries of phone conversations on Gemstone stationery and photographs of documents. Magruder testified he showed these Gemstone materials to Mitchell in a regular 8:30 morning meeting with him in his office in either CRP headquarters or his law firm, which was located in the same building. According to Magruder's testimony, Mitchell found the documents of no use and called Liddy to his office and told him the materials he received were not satisfactory and was not worth the money that he had paid for it. Magruder said Liddy explained there was a technical difficulty with one wiretap and that one had been improperly placed. Liddy said he would correct these matters and hopefully obtain useful information. Mitchell denied receiving any Gemstone material or informing Liddy that he was unhappy with the intelligence information. In fact, Mitchell testified that he did not see nor talk with Liddy between February 4, 1972 and June 15, 1972. However, Magruder's administrative assistant, Robert Reisner, testified that several weeks prior to June 17, 1972, Magruder handed him materials on stationery bearing the letterhead Gemstone for the purpose of preparing a file for Mr. Mitchell for a meeting between Mitchell and Magruder. Reisner also testified that, on another occasion, he saw gemstone stationery and envelopes and photographs or what appeared to be photographs with the stationery. Mr. Reisner identified committee exhibits 16 and 18, which are copies of gemstone stationery and the envelope for gemstone materials, as being the same type stationery and envelopes he saw in Magruder's office and used to prepare Mr. Mitchell's file. The gemstone envelopes bore the words "sensitive material" in large red capital letters and the words "handle as code word material" in smaller letters. In the lower left-hand corner of the envelope were printed the abbreviated words ex dis, followed by no dism. These abbreviations apparently stood for executive distribution and no dissemination. Also at the bottom of the gemstone stationery were the printed words, "Warning: this information is for intelligence purposes only. Exploitation may compromise source and terminate flow of information." Magruder also testified that he showed Strockman the gemstone documents he received from Liddy. He said that, because of their sensitive nature, he had Strockman view them in Magruder's office. He and Strockman, Magruder said, agreed there was no substance to the documents. Strockman denied that Magruder showed him wiretap reports or gemstone documents and said he never heard the term gemstone prior to June 17, 1972. Haldeman stated in a staff interview that Strockman never reported to him that he had seen a gemstone file. 4. Factors leading to the second break-in. The second Watergate break-in was apparently made to correct the difficulty experienced with the wiretap device on Mr. O'Brien's telephone. Dean testified that on June 19, 1972, 2 days after the June 17 break-in, he met with Liddy, who told him that the men arrested in the DNC were his men. When Dean asked Liddy why he had been in the DNC, he told Dean that Magruder had pushed him into doing it. He told me he had not wanted to do it, but Magruder had complained about the fact that they were not getting good information from a bug they had placed in the DNC earlier. He then explained something about the steel structure of the Watergate office building that was inhibiting transmission of the bug and that they had gone into the building to correct this problem. Dean later gave this same account to President Nixon on March 21, 1973. But Ehrlichman, during a meeting with the president and Haldeman on April 14, 1973, said Magruder told him that the second DNC break-in was Liddy's own notion and that neither Mitchell nor Magruder knew that another break-in was contemplated. Ehrlichman said Magruder told him that Liddy had met with Mitchell and, referencing the difficulties experienced, had only said, "Mr. Mitchell, I'll take care of it." McCord testified that Liddy had told him a second break-in was necessary because Mitchell wanted a second photographic operation and that, in addition, as long as that team was going in, that Mr. Mitchell wanted Mr. Liddy to check the malfunctioning of the second device that was put in and see what the problem was, because it was one of two things: either a malfunction of the equipment or the fact that the installation of the device was in a room which was surrounded by 4 walls. In other words, it was shielded, and he wanted this corrected and another device installed. In any event, it appears that the second DNC break-in in the early morning hours of June 17 was carried out with a sense of urgency by Liddy and without the planning engaged in for the first successful break-in. The urgency of the second break-in is emphasized by the fact that the burglars decided to proceed with the operation, even though McCord found that the tape initially placed on the garage door leading to the stairwell had been removed, making it necessary to pick the lock again. The risk of discovery was obvious to all the break-in team, yet after hurried consultation with Liddy in the Watergate Hotel, the decision was made to continue. A second piece of tape was placed on the basement garage door, an action that was the burglars' undoing, for it was the Watergate guard, Frank Wills, who had found the first piece of tape and removed it, thinking that one of the engineers for the building had put it on the door. When he made his rounds again and saw the door re-taped, he telephoned the police. Within minutes, Sergeant Leeper's plainclothes squad arrived at the Watergate office building, searched the stairwell, and entered the 6th floor offices of the Democratic National Committee headquarters. When Officer Barrett discovered the burglars and yelled, "Hold it! Come out!" the break-in team was apprehended in the midst of setting up photographic equipment. The next afternoon, Leeper obtained search warrants for the rooms which the burglars had occupied. There police found $4,200 in $100 bills, all with serial numbers in sequence, more electronic equipment, sets of blue surgical gloves, and a small notebook containing the name E. Howard Hunt. The burglary was over, but the Watergate scandal had just begun. End of section 3.
Section 4 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1, Chapter 1. The Cover-Up, Part 1. The Cover-Up. The news of the break-in at the DNC that reached the public in the newspapers on June 17th and 18th provided little hint of involvement of high campaign and administration officials. For many months, the facts set forth above regarding the planning and implementation of the Gemstone Plan were hidden from public view. This is because on June 17th, just hours after the burglars were arrested, a massive cover-up was begun to conceal the true facts from the nation. This cover-up eventually encompassed destruction and secretion of documents, obstruction of official investigations, subornation of perjury, and offers of money and executive clemency to the Watergate defendants to secure silence. That there was a cover-up of some form can no longer be seriously disputed, since 4 of its participants, John Dean, Jeb Magruder, Fred LaRue, and Bart Porter, have pleaded guilty to crimes related to it. Dean, Magruder, and LaRue have admitted involvement in a conspiracy to obstruct justice, the basis of which was their participation in cover-up activities, and Porter has confessed to making false statements to the FBI to hide the true Watergate facts. A. White House and CRP activity, first 3 days after the break-in. On the morning of June 17th, Liddy called Magruder in Los Angeles and informed him that 5 men, including McCord, had been apprehended in the DNC headquarters. Magruder, who was on a campaign trip with Mitchell, Fred LaRue, Robert Martian, and Bart Porter, repeated Liddy's report to LaRue, who relayed it to Mitchell. Magruder testified that later in the day, Mitchell told Martian to have Liddy speak to Kleindienst concerning the possibility of releasing McCord. Martian denied this, but LaRue said that Mitchell asked someone, probably Martian or Magruder, to tell Liddy to contact Kleindienst, who in turn was to contact Police Chief Jerry Wilson for details. In any event, in the late morning hours of Saturday, June 17th, Liddy, accompanied by CRP staffer Powell Moore, went to the Burning Tree Country Club near Washington to ask Kleindienst to arrange the release of the 5 Watergate burglars. Kleindienst, who had received word of the break-in from Henry Peterson at 8 a.m., telephoned Peterson in Liddy's presence and ordered that the Watergate 5 receive no special treatment. Kleindienst testified he then told Liddy to leave the premises. That afternoon, the scene of activity shifted to CRP headquarters. Liddy, rushing by Hugh Sloan, commented tersely, quote, "My boys got caught last night. I made a mistake. I used someone from here, which I told them I would never do. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job." End of quote. Robert Odle later observed Liddy go to the shredding room with a pile of documents about, quote, "a foot high," unquote. In a telephone conversation later in the day, Magruder, still in California, directed Odle and Robert Reisner to take certain sensitive CRP files home over the weekend. In particular, Magruder asked them to remove the blue file containing gemstone papers from the office. Reisner put the gemstone blue folder file in Odle's briefcase for Odle to remove. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation of the Watergate incident had begun. FBI agents first became aware of Hunt's involvement during the afternoon of June 17th, when, in the course of searching the 2 hotel rooms previously occupied by the arrested men, they discovered address books with White House telephone numbers used by Hunt and Liddy. The FBI interviewed Hunt on the evening of June 17th, but he revealed little. On that same evening, the FBI contacted Alexander Butterfield of the White House staff to determine Hunt's precise affiliation with the White House and to inform the White House that Hunt was possibly involved in the Watergate break-in. After the disclosure of McCord's association with CRP appeared in the newspapers on June 18th, Mitchell issued a statement from Los Angeles. Quote, McCord and the other 4 men arrested in Democratic headquarters Saturday were not operating either in our behalf or with our consent in the alleged bugging attempt. End quote. He commented further that there, quote, is no place in our campaign or in the electoral process for this type of activity, and we will not permit or condone it. End of quote. In a telephone conversation on June 18th, Magruder informed Haldeman, then in Key Biscayne with the president, of the break-in and McCord's involvement. Haldeman responded, Magruder said, by asking Magruder to, quote, get back to Washington immediately and talk with Mr. Dean and Mr. Strachan and Mr. Sloan and others on Monday to try to find out what actually happened and whose money it was, and so on. End of quote. Haldeman confirms the phone call, but he said the conversation concerned a review of a press release on the break-in. The next day, June 19th, Ronald Ziegler, also in Key Biscayne, announced that the White House was not conducting an inquiry into the Watergate incident. He declined to comment on what he termed a, quote, third-rate burglary attempt, unquote. On June 20th, the press reported that Hunt's name had been found in the address books of Barker and Martinez. After first identifying Hunt as a consultant to Colson, the White House later denied he worked for Colson. The cover-up began to take form in a number of meetings held on June 19th. Probably the most significant was an evening meeting in Mitchell's apartment attended by Mitchell, Magruder, LaRue, Martian, and Dean. Earlier in the day, Odell had returned various files, including the gemstone files, to Magruder. Magruder, according to his testimony, asked the others present at the meeting what he should do with these sensitive files. LaRue testified that Mitchell replied that it might be a good idea if Magruder had a fire in his house. Magruder similarly testified that those at the meeting concluded that the gemstone file should be destroyed immediately. Mitchell testified that there was no reference to a gemstone file at the meeting and that he did not suggest the destruction of any papers. Dean did not remember whether the destruction of files was mentioned. Martian testified that there was no discussion of destruction of, quote, gemstone files or sensitive files, unquote, while he was at the meeting. Dean testified that he participated in a number of other Watergate-related meetings and conversations on June 19th. On that morning, Ehrlichman told Dean to discover what he could about the Watergate incident and specifically to explore Colson's involvement. Dean immediately informed Ehrlichman of a conversation he had just had with Magruder, who had stated that, quote, this was all Liddy's fault, unquote. Dean later talked with Colson, who suggested that they should meet with Ehrlichman as soon as possible and expressed concern over the contents of Hunt's safe. Shortly before noon, Dean and Liddy met. Liddy told Dean that the men arrested in the break-in were, quote, his men, unquote, and that, quote, Magruder had pushed him into doing it, unquote. Dean testified that, shortly after his meeting with Liddy, Strachan came to Dean's office and reported that, at Haldeman's direction, he had removed and destroyed damaging materials from Haldeman's files over the weekend. Strachan later confirmed this in testimony before the committee. Haldeman testified he did not recall giving Strachan such instructions. Dean met with Ehrlichman twice during the afternoon of June 19th. In the first meeting, Dean testified he told Ehrlichman everything he had learned from Liddy, and Ehrlichman requested that Dean keep him advised of the results of his inquiries. Dean testified he also told Ehrlichman at this time about the earlier meetings he attended in Mitchell's office in late January and early February, and his subsequent conversation with Haldeman, where he expressed concern over the proposed Liddy plan. Ehrlichman testified he had no recollection of receiving such a report from Dean at that time. According to the edited presidential conversations, Ehrlichman made a similar statement to the president. Colson was present at the second meeting, during which, Dean testified, Ehrlichman instructed him to call Liddy and advise Liddy to tell Hunt to leave the country. Dean said he did this, quote, without even thinking, unquote, but later called Liddy back to retract the instruction after he and Colson convinced Ehrlichman that such a course would be unwise. Ehrlichman, however, testified that he gave Dean no orders to instruct Liddy to tell Hunt to leave the country. The edited presidential transcripts, page 1022, 1179-80, indicate that Ehrlichman told the president that he gave no such instruction. Colson raised at this meeting the matter of Hunt's safe and suggested, with Ehrlichman's concurrence, that Dean take custody of its contents. Bruce Carley, the White House staff secretary, entered the meeting and was instructed by Ehrlichman to have the safe opened in Dean's presence. The safe was opened that evening, after Dean had departed, by Carley with Fred Fielding, Dean's assistant, in attendance. Carley knew that the contents of the safe were to be delivered to Dean. Colson's concern about Hunt's safe apparently derived from a comment Hunt had made to Colson's secretary, Joan Hall, earlier in the day. Before leaving the White House for the last time, Hunt stopped by Colson's office and said to Hall, quote, "I just want you to know that the safe is loaded." End quote. On June 19th, or possibly June 20th, Dean also met with Kleindienst and Henry Peterson in Kleindienst's office. Kleindienst testified, and Peterson agreed, that the purpose of the meeting was, quote, "to inform Dean as counsel to the President that the Department of Justice and the FBI would be compelled and would immediately launch a full-scale, intensive, thorough investigation." End quote. Dean also testified he told Kleindienst earlier in the meeting, before Peterson arrived, that he was, quote, "very concerned that this matter could lead directly to the President," unquote, and that if the investigation led into the White House, he suspected that the chances of re-electing the President would be severely damaged. Dean also testified he informed Peterson, after Kleindienst left, that he had no idea where, quote, "this thing," unquote, might end, but he did not think the White House could stand a wide-open investigation. Dean said Peterson gave him, quote, "the impression that he realized the problems of a wide-open investigation of the White House in an election year," unquote. Peterson recalls only some discussion about a general probe of the White House in an election year. He gave assurances there would be no fishing expedition. B. The disposition of the contents of Hunt's safe. Dean testified that, in mid-morning on June 20th, GSA representatives brought him several cartons containing the contents of Hunt's safe, and in the afternoon he and Fielding examined these materials. In addition to electronic equipment in a briefcase, Dean discovered numerous memorandums to Colson regarding the plumbers, a psychological study of Ellsberg, various materials related to the Pentagon Papers, a number of classified State Department cables, and a forged cable implicating the Kennedy administration in the assassination of South Vietnamese President Diem. Dean called David Young, who agreed to store the classified cables in his office. Subsequently, Dean testified he met with Ehrlichman and described for him the contents of the safe. According to Dean's testimony, Ehrlichman instructed Dean to shred the documents and to, quote, "deep six," unquote, the briefcase containing the electronic equipment. Dean said that when he asked Ehrlichman what he meant by deep six, Ehrlichman explained, quote, "well, when you cross over the bridge on your way home, just toss the briefcase into the river," unquote. Fred Fielding has testified that Dean told him that Ehrlichman instructed Dean to, quote, "deep six," unquote, the briefcases. Ehrlichman denied to the committee that he gave such instructions. Ehrlichman also denied to the President that he, Ehrlichman, had given a deep six order. Dean testified he did not follow Ehrlichman's order. However, in January 1973, Dean, in fact, did destroy certain Hunt notebooks which had been in the safe. He did not volunteer this information to the special prosecutor until after he had pleaded guilty to a conspiracy to obstruct justice charge. Furthermore, he did not volunteer this information when he testified publicly or privately before this committee. Dean testified that on June 25th or 26th, he went to Ehrlichman to argue that, because there were many witnesses to the removal of the various items from the safe, it would be too dangerous to destroy them. He suggested that the material be turned over to the FBI and that sensitive documents be given directly to Patrick Gray, its acting director. By following this procedure, Dean said, he would be able to testify under oath that to the best of his knowledge, quote, "everything found in the safe had been turned over to the FBI," unquote. Dean retrieved the State Department cables from Young and, on June 26th or 27th, gave FBI agents all the materials from the safe except 2 envelopes containing politically sensitive materials and the Hunt notebooks. Dean told Ehrlichman what he had done on June 28th, apparently not mentioning the Hunt notebooks. Ehrlichman informed Dean that he was meeting with Gray later that day and that Dean should attend and bring the politically sensitive documents. Dean testified that when Gray met with Dean and Ehrlichman in Ehrlichman's office, Dean told Gray that the hunt materials had been turned over to the FBI agents with the exception of 2 envelopes which he did not believe related to Watergate in any way. But, Dean testified, he told Gray, quote, should they leak out, they would be political dynamite in an election year and thus should never be made public, unquote. Dean then gave the envelopes to Gray. Gray testified that Dean said that these files were, quote, political dynamite, unquote, and, quote, clearly should not see the light of day, unquote. He testified that, although Ehrlichman and Dean did not expressly instruct him to destroy the files, quote, the implication of the substance and tone of their remarks was that these 2 files were to be destroyed, and I interpreted this to be an order from the counsel to the President of the United States, issued in the presence of one of the 2 top assistants to the President of the United States, unquote. Ehrlichman has denied that anyone instructed Gray that the documents in the envelope should never see the light of day. However, Gray, in December 1972, burned the documents at his home in Connecticut. C. White House concern over the Mexican and Dahlberg checks. On the morning of June 21, 1972, Ehrlichman called Gray to inform him that Dean would be handling the Watergate inquiry for the White House and that he should deal directly with Dean on Watergate matters. Dean and Gray met on the 21st and again on the 22nd. During these meetings, Gray informed Dean that the FBI, in the course of investigating the $100 bills found on the burglars and in their hotel rooms, had discovered that 4 Mexican checks totaling $89,000 and a check for $25,000 from Kenneth Dahlberg, which were originally contributed to the president's campaign, had been deposited in Bernard Barker's bank account in Miami. Dean testified that, about the same time, Mitchell and Stans asked him to attempt to prevent disclosure of the Dahlberg check, which might prove embarrassing for Dwayne Andreas, the campaign contributor behind the check. Dean testified he went to see Gray on June 22nd at the request of Haldeman and Ehrlichman to discuss the Dahlberg and Mexican checks. Dean had been informed by Stans that the checks had reached Barker's account after Sloan turned the checks over to Liddy for cashing. Liddy had used Barker for this purpose. The serial numbers on the $100 bills obtained from the burglars demonstrated that this was money Barker gave Liddy when he cashed the Mexican and Dahlberg checks. D. White House use of the CIA to restrict the FBI Watergate investigation. On June 22nd, Helms and Gray conversed by telephone. According to Gray, Helms, during that conversation, assured Gray that the CIA had nothing to do with the Watergate break-in. Haldeman testified that the next day, acting at President Nixon's direction after meeting with him, Haldeman and Ehrlichman called CIA Director Helms and Deputy Director Walters to the White House for a meeting. At this session, according to Helms and Walters, Haldeman asked if there were any CIA connection with the Watergate break-in. Helms replied there was none. Haldeman, however, suggested that an FBI investigation in Mexico might uncover CIA operations or assets. Helms replied that no FBI investigation of Watergate would jeopardize any CIA operations. Nevertheless, Haldeman and Ehrlichman directed Walters to meet with Gray and tell him that any further investigation into Mexico could endanger CIA assets there. Ehrlichman contends the meeting's only conclusion was that Walters and Gray, quote, would sit down together and talk through what the problems might be, unquote. Haldeman does not recall that the question of the Mexican money was raised at the meeting with Helms and Walters or with the president earlier in the day. But Haldeman testified that he did request Walters to meet with Gray to assure that the FBI investigation would not expose, quote, earlier national security or CIA activities, unquote. Ehrlichman, however, recalled the president's concern about, quote, the Mexican money or the Florida bank or whatever, unquote. Walters and Gray met later in the afternoon. Walters told Gray he had just talked with, quote, senior staff members at the White House and then related the White House concern about the investigation into the Mexican money. Gray assured Walters that he would abide by the general agency agreement that the CIA and the FBI would not expose each other's sources. A memorandum which Walters prepared on this meeting indicates that Gray was concerned with how to, quote, low-key, unquote, the Watergate investigation. But Gray testified he did not mean to imply, quote, that the FBI investigation would be other than aggressive and thorough, unquote, and only wanted to, quote, pursue this investigation without compromising CIA assets and resources, unquote. After the meeting between Walters and Gray, Gray telephoned Dean, who urged that the FBI not conduct any interviews that would expose CIA sources. Gray agreed to postpone temporarily the interview of Manuel Ogario, whose name appeared on the 4 Mexican checks deposited in Barker's account. Meanwhile, General Walters, after discussions at the CIA, had concluded that the ongoing FBI investigation could not jeopardize any CIA sources or activities in Mexico. On June 26th, Walters was called by Dean regarding the matters Haldeman and Ehrlichman had earlier discussed with Walters at the White House. Walters testified that he checked on Dean with Ehrlichman, who told him it was appropriate to discuss these items with Dean because, quote, he is in charge of the whole matter, unquote. Walters met with Dean on June 26th. He testified and Dean confirmed that Dean pressed him about the possibility of CIA involvement in the Watergate break-in, and that he emphasized to Dean that there was no CIA connection. He said he told Dean, quote, Mr. Dean, any attempt to involve the agency in the stifling of this affair would be a disaster. It would destroy the credibility of the agency with the Congress, with the nation. It would be a grave disservice to the President. I will not be a party to it, and I am prepared to resign before I do anything that would implicate the agency in this matter, unquote. Walters testified that the following morning, June 27th, he again received a telephone call from Dean asking him to come to Dean's office. He said Dean told him that, quote, some of the suspects were wobbling and might talk, unquote, and that Dean again asked if he had discovered any CIA involvement in the matter. Walters testified that, when he replied that there was none, Dean asked whether there was any way the CIA could meet the bail or pay the salaries of the defendants while they were in jail. Walters said he informed Dean there was no way the agency could involve itself in this. Dean testified that he first heard discussion concerning payments to the defendants at a meeting on June 23rd or 24th with Martian, Mitchell, and LaRue, where Martian told the group, quote, the CIA could take care of this entire matter if they wished, unquote. Walters testified that on June 28th, Dean called him again, asking him to come to his office. Dean then told Walters that a scheduled meeting between Helms and Gray had been canceled and that Ehrlichman wanted Gray to deal with Walters instead. Dean asked whether Walters could assist to limit the FBI investigation to the 5 defendants. Walters said he had no authority in this matter and told Dean that the CIA could become involved only at the President's direction. Dean confirmed this testimony. Dean testified that his meetings with Walters were at Ehrlichman's express request. Dean said Ehrlichman told him to deal with Walters because he was a good friend of the White House, that the White House had installed him as deputy director so it could have influence over the CIA. On the evening of July 5th, Gray telephoned Walters and said he would pursue the investigation in Mexico unless Helms or Walters wrote a letter stating that the investigation would uncover CIA assets or activities. The next morning, Walters met with Gray. Walters testified, quote, I told Mr. Gray right at the outset that I could not tell, and even less could I give him a letter saying that the pursuit of the FBI's investigation would in any way jeopardize CIA activities in Mexico, unquote. It was at this meeting, Gray testified, that he first suspected that someone might be trying to interfere with his investigation. After Walters left Gray's office, Gray called Clark McGregor in San Clemente and expressed the opinion that, quote, people on the White House staff are careless and indifferent in their use of the CIA and FBI, unquote. Gray asked McGregor to inform President Nixon of his problem. 37 minutes later, the president telephoned Gray. Gray testified that he said to the president, quote, Mr. President, there is something that I want to speak to you about. Dick Walters and I feel that people on your staff are trying to mortally wound you by using the CIA and FBI and by confusing the question of CIA interest in or not in people the FBI wishes to interview, unquote. Gray testified that after a, quote, slight pause, unquote, the president said, quote, Pat, you just continue to conduct your aggressive and thorough investigation, unquote. Gray testified he believed his message to the president was, quote, adequate to put him on notice that the members of the White House staff were using the FBI and the CIA, unquote. However, in his May 22, 1973 statement, the president maintained that, despite his July 6th conversation with Gray, he was not aware of, quote, efforts to limit the investigation or to conceal possible involvement of members of the administration and the campaign committee, unquote. The president did not ask Gray what people on the staff were trying to use the CIA and FBI. He did not indicate that the charges were serious or that he would suspend or fire those involved. Gray testified, quote, "Frankly, I expected the president to ask me some questions, and for 2 weeks thereafter, I think it was on the 12th and again the 28th, I asked General Walters if the president had called him. And when I heard nothing, I began to feel that General Walters and I were alarmists," unquote. In his May 22, 1973 statement, the president admitted directing Haldeman and Ehrlichman to take steps to ensure that the FBI Watergate investigation not expose, quote, "an unrelated covert operation of the CIA," unquote. The president also conceded in his May 22 statement that he had directed Haldeman and Ehrlichman to restrict the FBI Watergate investigation to prevent the exposure of the activities of the plumbers. As is shown later in this report, the payoffs and promises made to Howard Hunt appear to have been largely motivated by a fear of Hunt's revelation of his activities for the plumbers. E. Mardian-LaRue-Liddy meeting. On June 20th or 21st, 1972, Liddy, Mardian, and LaRue met in LaRue's apartment to allow Liddy to give a first-hand report of the Watergate operation. Liddy told Mardian and LaRue that he had employed the 5 men arrested at the DNC, that he and Hunt had organized the operation, that they had occupied a room in the Watergate Hotel during the break-in, and that he had shredded documents from his files that related to the break-in. Liddy assured LaRue and Mardian that the operation could not be traced to him, but that if an investigation did implicate him, he would never reveal any information. He stated that he was even willing to be assassinated, quote, "on any street corner at any time," unquote, if LaRue and Mardian were not satisfied with his assurances. Mardian testified that Liddy conveyed the impression that he conducted the break-in, quote, "on the express authority of the president," unquote, with CIA assistance. According to Mardian, Liddy said Hunt felt it was CRP's obligation to provide bail money, legal fees, and family support. LaRue testified that Liddy did not discuss who had approved the Watergate operation, although he did mention that Magruder had been pressuring him to improve the surveillance equipment in the DNC offices. During this meeting, LaRue first became aware of financial commitments to the Watergate defendants for bail, attorney's fees, and family support. On the same day, LaRue and Mardian briefed Mitchell on Liddy's report. According to Mitchell, he then learned, for the first time, of Liddy's involvement in the Watergate burglary, quote, "the Ellsberg matter, the Dita Beard matter, and a few of the other little gems," unquote. Referring to these other scandals as, quote, "White House horrors," unquote, Mitchell testified that, in his opinion, their exposure would have been more destructive to the re-election campaign than the Watergate break-in, and that therefore he had participated in activities to conceal those matters from the public during the campaign. End of Section 4. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Section 5 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1, Chapter 1, The Cover-Up, Part 2. F. Pressures on Hugh Sloan. On June 22, 1972, FCRP Treasurer Hugh Sloan and Magruder met in Magruder's office prior to Sloan's being interviewed by FBI agents later in the day. Magruder suggested the total amount Sloan had disbursed to Liddy was approximately $75,000 to $80,000. When Sloan protested that this figure was far too low and that he had no intention of perjuring himself, Magruder, according to Sloan's testimony, replied, quote, "You may have to," unquote. On the same day, Sloan testified, he was questioned by LaRue concerning a $50,000 cash contribution delivered to Sloan by Herbert Porter after April 7, 1972. Sloan confirmed to LaRue that he had received this cash, which was then still in his safe because Porter had never identified its source. Sloan testified that, when he expressed his concerns regarding the large expenditures of money to Mitchell, Mitchell's only response was, quote, "When the going gets tough, the tough get going," unquote. Sloan testified that he did not understand what Mitchell meant and found his remark of no assistance. Magruder confirms Sloan's recollection of Mitchell's response to Sloan's expressions of concern. The FBI interview of Sloan was confined to the identification of Alfred Baldwin and his employment at CRP. After this interview, Sloan testified, LaRue sought a briefing on the FBI's questions and emphasized to Sloan the importance of giving a low figure for, quote, the Liddy money, unquote, because it was, quote, very politically sensitive, unquote. Sloan was becoming very concerned and thought he should talk to top White House officials about the troublesome CRP financial transactions. He arranged an appointment with Ehrlichman on June 23rd. Prior to that meeting, Sloan testified, he stopped by Dwight Chapin's office, expressed his concerns, and was told by Chapin that he was only overwrought and needed a vacation. Sloan testified that, when he met with Ehrlichman, he did not, quote, point fingers, unquote. He did not mention his conversation with Magruder, but told Ehrlichman he believed that somebody, quote, external to the campaign, unquote, should look at the cash disbursements since the entire campaign might be in danger. According to Sloan, Ehrlichman's initial response was to interpret Sloan's statement as a personal problem. Ehrlichman said he would be glad to help Sloan obtain a lawyer, but then, Sloan testified, Ehrlichman said, quote, do not tell me any details. I do not want to know. My position would have to be until after the election that I would have to take executive privilege, unquote.
Ehrlichman generally concurred in Sloan's testimony.
On June 23rd, Sloan made a final report to Stans on cash disbursements of pre-April 7th contributions. This report showed cash disbursements totaling $1,777,000. Of this amount, Liddy had received $199,000. Other cash disbursements of significance were $250,000 to Kalmbach, $350,000 to Strachan, $100,000 to Porter, and $20,000 to Magruder. As of the final report to Stans, there was a balance of $81,000 in cash remaining. According to Sloan, Stans, fearing a GAO audit, told Sloan to take approximately $40,000 of the remaining $81,000 home with him. Sloan understood that Stans would take a similar amount with him. However, Sloan said that Stans later told him he never removed the money from the office. On June 23rd, at Herbert Kalmbach's suggestion, Sloan destroyed the cash book he had used to prepare the report for Stans. Stans later gave his $40,000 to LaRue either directly or through Mardian. Sloan gave his $40,000 to LaRue about July 5, 1972, after receiving a telephone call from LaRue asking about the money. Around June 24th, according to Magruder, Mitchell and Magruder requested that Stans, quote, try to work with Mr. Sloan to see if Mr. Sloan could be more cooperative about what had happened with the money, unquote. Sloan testified that he met with Mardian and gave him a full report on the cash disbursements from the pre-April 7th contributions. Sloan recalls that when Mardian learned about the $199,000 to Liddy, he exploded, saying, quote, Magruder lied to John Mitchell. He told him it was only $40,000, unquote. Mardian's account is basically consistent with Sloan's. On July 5th, after Sloan had returned from a Bermuda vacation, Magruder asked him to have a drink at the Black Horse Tavern. During this meeting, Magruder suggested that they visit U.S. Attorney Harold Titus. Magruder said he would tell Titus he authorized the payments to Liddy and that Sloan should merely confirm he made distributions under Magruder's instructions. However, according to Sloan, Magruder said that they had to agree on a figure. The figure mentioned this time by Magruder, $40,000 to $45,000, was even lower than the figure Magruder suggested earlier. Sloan testified he told Magruder he would think about the request. But when Sloan met Magruder again on the morning of July 6th, he told Magruder he would not perjure himself. Sloan said Magruder dropped the subject and never again suggested seeing Titus. According to Sloan, LaRue checked with him later that day to ascertain whether he had agreed on a figure with Magruder, but when Sloan informed LaRue what he told Magruder, LaRue discontinued the conversation. On July 6th, Sloan testified, he met with Kenneth Parkinson and Paul O'Brien, attorneys for CRP, during their debriefing of Mrs. Judy Hoback, Sloan's bookkeeper, following her testimony before the grand jury. Robert Odle was also present at the beginning of the meeting. Sloan testified he asked everyone to leave the room except the attorneys because he wanted to talk to them alone. Sloan then gave O'Brien and Parkinson a complete accounting of the cash disbursements and also informed them of Magruder's efforts to have Sloan alter his story. Sloan testified that O'Brien and Parkinson became angry and said, quote, Well, we have been lied to by the people here. We have not even been able to see John Mitchell, and we are a month in this thing," unquote. Sloan said the attorneys remarked that with the new information they had available to them, they needed time to confront other campaign officials, and suggested that Sloan leave town if he had any legitimate business reason to do so. Mr. Stans at that time was on a trip on the West Coast, and the attorneys suggested that Sloan join him. Stans, during his testimony, recalled that Mardian recommended that Sloan join him in California. That evening, Sloan received a telephone call from LaRue, in which LaRue impressed on him the urgency of his departure to California. LaRue suggested he take a 6 a.m. flight from Dulles Airport the next morning. Sloan followed this recommendation. Sloan returned from California on July 12th and met with LaRue the next day. Sloan said LaRue began by reviewing the options open to Sloan. He suggested that Sloan might have campaign law problems and might consider taking the Fifth Amendment with regard to any testimony before the grand jury. Sloan remarked to LaRue that it appeared obvious to him that the only way for him to stay in favor with the campaign organization was either to commit perjury or plead the Fifth Amendment, but that he would do neither. He told LaRue it would probably be in the interest of all concerned if he resigned. LaRue did not challenge Sloan's assessment of the situation, and suggested that he talk to Stans. Sloan called Stans that evening. Stans told him not to talk on the telephone, but to come to see him the following morning. When Sloan met Stans the next morning, July 14th, Stans told him that he had already informed the FBI that Sloan had resigned. Although Sloan had not yet resigned, he did so immediately. Stans confirmed to the call, stating that Sloan wanted to talk about his resignation. On the same day, Sloan retained a lawyer, and on July 20th, he and his attorney met with Messrs. Silbert, Glanzer, and Campbell of the U.S. Attorney's Office and gave them a complete statement, including Sloan's account of Magruder's efforts to suborn his perjury. G. Magruder and Porter perjury. Mitchell resigned his position as campaign director on June 30th, 1972, but Magruder was retained as deputy director. Dean testified that during the last 10 days of June, he attended a meeting in Haldeman's office, where Haldeman and Ehrlichman asked Dean for his recommendation on removing Mitchell and Magruder from the re-election committee. Dean said he told them there was a real chance Magruder would be indicted, and thus should be removed in a graceful way that would not jeopardize his position. Dean was therefore surprised when it was publicly announced that Mitchell was resigning, but that Magruder would remain. He said it was clear to him that Magruder was the link to the White House, and that he might not hold his tongue if indicted. Dean testified that he specifically warned Haldeman about this possibility. Thereafter, Dean testified, Haldeman and Ehrlichman displayed a greatly increased interest in Magruder's problem. Dean testified he kept them informed on the strategy being developed to create the appearance that involvement in the break-in stopped at Liddy. Haldeman and Ehrlichman, according to Dean, frequently asked him how Magruder was progressing with the FBI investigation and his preparation for the grand jury. Dean said he also received calls concerning Magruder's status from Larry Higbee, Haldeman's staff assistant. Ehrlichman, however, denies he used Dean as a liaison man to keep informed about Magruder. Magruder testified, and Mitchell confirmed, that he, Magruder, volunteered to develop a cover-up story that would conceal his involvement and leave Liddy as the top figure in the Watergate conspiracy. He said it was important that involvement be stopped at Liddy since, quote, if it got to me, it would go higher, unquote. The cover-up story, Magruder testified, was developed during a series of meetings from the time of the break-in until his second grand jury appearance, most of which were in Mitchell's office. Attending the meetings were Mitchell, LaRue, Mardian, Dean, and himself. At some point prior to his second grand jury appearance on August 18, 1972, a rationale was developed to justify Liddy's expenditure of almost $200,000. Magruder testified that the story invented involved exaggerating, quote, to the tune of $230,000, unquote, the amount of money spent on certain legitimate activities for which Liddy was responsible. Magruder said that Porter was willing to help him on the cover-up story, quote, so he took care of, in effect, $100,000, and I took care of, in effect, $150,000, by indicating that Mr. Liddy had legal projects for us in the intelligence field, unquote. Magruder worked on this story with Mitchell, Dean, LaRue, and Mardian. Quote, my primary contacts on the story were Mr. Dean and Mr. Mitchell, Magruder told the committee. Dean agrees. Ehrlichman, during a meeting with the president and Haldeman on April 14, 1973, stated that Mitchell had admitted being present when Dean helped Magruder prepare false testimony for the grand jury. Porter testified he agreed to join in the false cover-up story when Magruder swore to him that neither Magruder nor anyone higher than Liddy in the campaign or the White House had any involvement in the Watergate break-in. Porter said Magruder told him the problem was with the amount of money spent, that Liddy was authorized to spend the money for certain dirty tricks, but, quote, nothing illegal, unquote, and that the figures could be very embarrassing to the president, Mitchell, Haldeman, and others. Magruder told Porter that his name was suggested as someone whom, quote, we can count on to help in this situation, unquote. Together they agreed that Porter would falsely tell the FBI and the grand jury that $100,000 of the money Liddy spent was for the purpose of infiltrating radical groups that could endanger the personal safety of the surrogate speakers for whom Porter was responsible. Dean testified he informed Haldeman and Ehrlichman of Magruder's fabricated story and Porter's corroboration. Ehrlichman, however, contended that Dean did not apprise him of such information. LaRue testified that during June, July, and August he attended meetings at which Magruder discussed his cover-up story, which LaRue knew to be false. LaRue said his motivation in helping prepare this fake account was a desire to do all in his power to keep secret information regarding the connection between the burglary and CRP. Mitchell testified that he listened to rehearsals of Magruder's story, which he knew to be perjurious. Prior to their appearances before the grand jury, Magruder and Porter gave the false cover-up story to FBI agents. When Magruder made his first grand jury appearance on July 5, 1972, he testified only as to the organization of the CRP. However, when called for his second appearance on August 18, 1972, he was aware he was a target of its investigation. The day before his grand jury appearance, he was briefed by lawyers for CRP and Mr. Mardian. Ehrlichman informed the president of these activities during an April 15, 1973 meeting, stating that, quote, apparently Mardian was able to get around and coach witnesses, unquote. He, quote, was very heavy-handed, unquote, and asked the witnesses, quote, to say things that weren't true, unquote. Magruder, before his second appearance, was interrogated for approximately 2 hours by Dean and approximately 1/2 hour by Mitchell. Dean, fully aware of the false story Magruder was going to tell, played, quote, devil's advocate, unquote, asking Magruder questions the prosecutor might ask. On August 18, 1972, Magruder gave the false cover-up story to the grand jury. After Magruder's appearance, Dean, at Haldeman's request, called Assistant Attorney General Henry Peterson to ask how Magruder's testimony had gone. Dean testified Peterson said Magruder, quote, had made it through by the skin of his teeth, unquote. According to Peterson, who subsequently informed the president of this call during an April 16, 1973 meeting, he later called Dean back to give him Assistant U.S. Attorney Earl Silbert's evaluation. Quote, Magruder had been a good witness in his own behalf, unquote, but that no one believed, quote, the story about the money, unquote. Dean repeated Peterson's comments to Mitchell, Magruder, and Haldeman. Dean testified that Haldeman was, quote, very pleased, unquote, because the White House strategy to, quote, stop the involvement at Liddy, unquote, was succeeding. Magruder was called before the grand jury a third time in early September to testify concerning entries in his diary reflecting meetings in Mitchell's office on January 27th and February 4th among Liddy, Magruder, Dean, and Mitchell. Magruder testified he met with Mitchell and Dean to arrive at an explanation for these diary entries. The story finally developed that the first meeting on January 27th had been canceled, and that at the second, the participants discussed the new election law. The presence at the meeting of Liddy, counsel for CRP, and of Dean, counsel to the president, gave some credence to this account. An initial suggestion that the diary entries be erased was abandoned when it was recognized that erasures could be discovered by the FBI. Magruder testified he gave this false story to the grand jury when he appeared. H. Participation of White House and CRP personnel in FBI interviews. White House and CRP officials took other steps to keep abreast of and interfere with the Watergate investigation. When White House staff personnel were interviewed by FBI agents, Dean or his assistant, Fred Fielding, attended the interviews. Also, in most cases when FBI agents interviewed CRP staff persons, CRP counsel O'Brien or Parkinson were present. And on October 12th, the White House received 82 FBI investigative reports relating to Watergate. The interest in and preparation for the FBI interview of Kathleen Chenow, the secretary for the Plumbers, is illustrative of the concern and activity in the White House regarding the FBI's investigation. Dean testified that, when the FBI indicated its interest in Chenow, she was in London. Dean discussed the Chenow matter with Ehrlichman and suggested that someone go to London and explain to her that she should not reveal to the FBI Hunt's and Liddy's activities with the Plumbers. With Ehrlichman's approval, Fielding flew to London and brought Chenow back to Washington on first-class airline accommodations paid for by the White House. Fielding and Young briefed Chenow before her FBI interview and were present when the FBI questioned her. Moreover, special arrangements were developed to prevent top White House officials from directly testifying before the grand jury. Certain officials, Coulson, Krogh, Young, Chapin, and Strachan, were permitted to give their testimony to the prosecutors at the Department of Justice and were therefore not exposed to direct questioning by grand jurors. When Dean asked Peterson to repeat this special procedure for Maurice Stans, Peterson at first refused. Under direction from the president, Ehrlichman then approached Peterson and Kleindienst to prevent Stans from appearing before the grand jury. Although both told Ehrlichman he could not dictate policy to the Justice Department, they agreed to make another concession for Stans and permitted his interrogation by the prosecutors, with no grand jurors present. In considering the FBI investigation, it is important to note that neither the FBI nor other Department of Justice personnel interviewed Robert A. Reisner, the administrative assistant to CRP Deputy Director Magruder. The first time Reisner was subpoenaed by any investigative body was on or about March 30, 1973, when he was subpoenaed by this committee. The failure to question Reisner was a crucial omission because, as Magruder later testified, the cover-up might have ended months earlier if Reisner had been interrogated. I. The President's statement of August 29th, the so-called Dean Report. On August 29, 1972, President Nixon, at a press conference, told the American people that Dean had conducted a, quote, complete investigation, unquote, for the White House, which enabled the President to declare, quote, I can state categorically that no one in the White House staff, no one in this administration presently employed, was involved in this very bizarre incident, unquote. The President was briefed for this press conference by Ehrlichman and Ziegler. Dean testified before the committee that there was no, quote, Dean report, unquote, that he never made the investigation referred to by the President. To the contrary, Dean testified, far from investigating, he was spending most of his time participating in the cover-up on instructions from Haldeman and Ehrlichman as liaison between the White House and CRP. The edited presidential conversations of a March 20, 1973 telephone call between the President and Dean cast further light on the President's August 29th statement. In the March 20th telephone call, the President suggested to Dean that he prepare some kind of report that would appear complete but would be, quote, very incomplete, unquote, which the President could use for public release and to reassure the Cabinet. Dean asked, quote, as we did when you, back in August, made that statement that, unquote, and the President replied, quote, that's right, unquote. J. The September 15th meeting between Dean and the President. The grand jury returned indictments against Liddy, Hunt, McCord, Barker, Sturgis, Martinez, and Gonzalez on September 15th. Charging a number of crimes arising out of the Watergate break-in. The cover-up had worked, and the indictments had stopped with Liddy. Higher CRP and White House officials were not yet exposed. John W. Hushen, the Justice Department's Director of Public Information, declared on that day that the department had concluded its investigation, stating, quote, we have absolutely no evidence to indicate that any others should be charged, unquote. Hushen's comments were followed the next day by those of Attorney General Kleindienst, who said that the investigation by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office had been, quote, one of the most extensive, objective, and thorough, unquote, in many years. That same day, Assistant Attorney General Peterson denied there had been a, quote, whitewash, unquote, and cited statistics to prove the thoroughness of the investigation. On September 15th, after the indictments were issued, the President summoned Dean to the Oval Office. Haldeman was also present. Dean testified, quote, The president told me that Haldeman had kept him posted on my handling of the Watergate case. The president told me I had done a good job and he appreciated how difficult a task it had been. And the president was pleased that the case had stopped with Liddy. I told him that all that I had been able to do was to contain the case and assist in keeping it out of the White House. I also told him that there was a long way to go before this matter would end, and that I certainly could make no assurances that the day would not come when this matter would start to unravel, unquote. According to Dean, other topics discussed at the meeting included the bugging of the 1968 Nixon campaign, the date of the criminal trial, progress in the various Watergate civil suits, press coverage of Watergate, a GAO audit,
the Patman Committee's inquiry,
use of the IRS to attack administration, quote, enemies, unquote, and post-election plans to place officials responsive to White House requirements in the IRS and other federal agencies. He said the president also asked him, quote, to keep a good list of the press people giving us trouble because we will make life difficult for them after the election, unquote. When he left the meeting, Dean said he was, quote, convinced, unquote, that the president was aware of the cover-up. Haldeman gave a different version of this meeting. He denied any contemporaneous knowledge of the cover-up or that he had informed the president of such activities. He testified that the president merely showed his satisfaction as to Dean's investigative work, which had shown no involvement of White House personnel in the break-in. Haldeman confirmed that the 1968 bugging of the Nixon campaign was discussed along with the civil suit, the GAO audit, the Patman Committee investigation, and use of the IRS. Alexander Butterfield's testimony before the committee revealed that there is a complete tape recording of what was said by the participants at the September 15th meeting. This fact was corroborated by Haldeman, who informed the committee that he had in fact listened to the tape. The committee on July 17, 1973, requested the president to provide the committee with the tape recording of this meeting, among others. When the president refused this on July 23, 1973, the committee issued a subpoena to the president for this and other tape recordings. The president, on July 25, 1973, refused to comply with this subpoena, and the matter was taken to court. See Chapter 9. The Select Committee has now received, along with the American public, an edited, unauthenticated partial transcription of the tape recording of this conversation and others, prepared by the White House. These transcripts are not conclusive proof as to the contents of these conversations. They contain a number of deletions, and portions of the taped conversation are alleged to be inaudible or unintelligible. Also, transcripts cannot provide voice tone and inflections, which at times are crucial to understanding the meaning of speakers' words. Moreover, the presidential version of the September 15th meeting differs in significant respects from that purportedly prepared by the House Judiciary Committee, which has a copy of the actual recording. At the least, however, the presidential transcripts are useful as White House versions of what occurred, and thus, with the caveat that they are not the best evidence available, they have been utilized by the committee in the preparation of this report. The transcript of the September 15th meeting supports many aspects of Dean's testimony. Thus, the transcript begins with the president's greeting Dean, quote, "You had quite a day today, didn't you? You got Watergate on the way, didn't you?" Unquote. Dean replied, quote, "We tried," unquote, and then in answer to Haldeman's question, quote, "How did it all end up?" unquote, answered, quote, "I think we can say well at this point," unquote.
Footnote. The purported House version also has Dean responding, quote, "Quite a 3 months," unquote. End of footnote.
Shortly thereafter, the following colloquy occurred. Dean: 3 months ago, I would have had trouble predicting there would be a day when this would be forgotten, but I think I can say that 54 days from now, nothing is going to come crashing down to our surprise. President: That what? Dean: Nothing is going to come crashing down to our surprise. President: Oh, well, this is a can of worms, as you know, a lot of this stuff that went on.
And the people who worked this way are awfully embarrassed.
But the way you have handled all this seems to me has been very skillful, putting your fingers in the leaks that have sprung here and sprung there.
Footnote. The purported House version reads, quote, "But the way you've handled it, it seems to me, has been very skillful, because putting your fingers in the dike every time that leaks have sprung here and sprung there," unquote. End of footnote.
Dean: Well, as I see it, the only problems we may have are the human ones, and I will keep a close watch on that. President: Union? Dean, human. Haldeman, human frailties. Dean, people get annoyed, some finger pointing, false accusations. President, you mean on this case? Dean, on this case. There's some bitterness between the Finance Committee and the Political Committee. They feel they're taking all the heat and all the people upstairs are bad people, not being recognized. President, we are all in it together. This is a war. We take a few shots and it will be over. We will give them a few shots and it will be over. Don't worry. I wouldn't want to be on the other side right now, would you? The transcript also records significant discussion relating to possible hearings proposed by Congressman Wright Patman, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee. Dean, the Patman Committee is the last forum where we may have the least problem right now. Kennedy has already said he may call hearings of the Administrative Practices Subcommittee. As these committees spin out oracles, we used to get busy on each one. I stopped doing that about 2 months ago. We just take one thing at a time.
Footnote. The purported House version reads, quote, as this case has been all along, you spin out horribles that you can conceive of, and so we just don't do that. I stopped that about 2 months ago, unquote. End of footnote.
President, you really can't sit and worry about it all the time. The worst may happen, but it may not. So you just try and button it up as well as you can and hope for the best. And remember, basically, the damn business is unfortunately trying to cut our losses.
Footnote. The House version allegedly states in part, quote, and remember that basically the damn business is just one of those unfortunate things. We're trying to cut our losses, unquote. End of footnote.
Dean, certainly that is right, and certainly it has had no effect on you. That's the good thing. Haldeman, no. It has been kept away from the White House and, of course, completely away from the president. The only tie to the White House is the Colson effort they keep trying to pull in. Dean, and, of course, the 2 White House people of lower level indicted, 1 consultant and 1 a member of the domestic staff. That is not very much of a tie. Haldeman, that's right. The edited transcript does not contain a statement by Dean as he testified that, quote, all that I have been able to do was to contain the case and assist in keeping it out of the White House, unquote, and that, quote, there was a long way to go before this matter would end, and I certainly could make no assurances that the day would not come when this matter would start to unravel, unquote. Although the edited transcript also does not reflect a discussion between the president and Dean regarding the use of the IRS respecting administration enemies, or any specific reference to an IRS investigation of DNC Chairman Lawrence O'Brien, the reconstruction of this meeting prepared by White House counsel Fred Buzzhart and submitted to the committee confirms that there was such a discussion at the September 15th meeting. Moreover, the transcript indicates that the final portion of the conversation is deleted. End of Section 5. Recording by Colleen McMahon.